Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today, and it's great to see you all. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage everyone to turn their cameras on if they're comfortable and able. It would be great to see you all and to see you on screen and just be here with you both today. So please, if you're comfortable and able, turn your cameras on and just be with us for this hour. But I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Leah Keener, and I'm Bay Nature's event coordinator. And yes, thanks again to you all for joining for today's Tide Pooling Ask the Naturalist with Rebecca Johnson. Before we begin, I just want to introduce Bay Nature Magazine as well. For those of you who don't know, we are a quarterly print publication based in Berkeley, and we focus on conservation and nature topics. But in addition, we're also working on hosting a bunch of in-person and online events like the one that we're at today. We also have hikes, and we have our in-person talks, as well as these Ask the Naturalist events. So without further ado, I'd really like to introduce Rebecca Johnson. Rebecca is Bay Nature's board chair, but is also a tide pooling expert and the co-director of Cal Academy Center for Biodiversity and Community Science. She earned her bachelor's of integrative biology at UC Berkeley and a master's in systematics and ecology from San Francisco State University and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from UC Santa Cruz. She's also, through her position, helped to found events like the City Nature Challenge, Snapshot Cal Coast, and many more. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us today. It's great to see you. Yeah.
Hi, Leah. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here and to spend our kind of lunchtime talking about tide pools.
Yeah. Thank you so much for making the time. And
Sure.
so the format of this event is an Ask the Naturalist. So it really is based around the questions that you all have. And the topic that we're learning about today is tide pooling and nudibranchs and marine ecology. So to kick us off, I'll just start asking some pretty general questions about tide pooling and about marine ecosystems and nudibranchs. And if any of you at any point have questions, please enter them in the chat, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Just type them in. And then I will call on you, and then you're free to ask your question and unmute, or if you'd rather, I can also ask your question. But please, if you have questions, don't hold back. We're here to answer these questions and ask. So please just don't hold back and look forward to seeing what questions you have. But to start out, I have a set of general questions about tide pooling for Rebecca, and I'll start us with that. But yes, I will be monitoring the chat, and whenever I see questions come in, I will pause my questions and turn to yours. So my first question, Rebecca, is can you tell us a bit about how you got into tide pooling, and can you share your experience with it? Do you remember your first time tide pooling, where it was, what got you into it, and yeah, what that experience for you has been like?
Um, yeah, sure. So I grew up in Southern California, near the beaches of kind of Malibu and Ventura County. And so spent a lot of time at the beach as a kid. And so my first experiences tide pooling were there. I have to admit, my first experiences with marine invertebrates were not really tide pool invertebrates, but really sandy beach invertebrates, right? So digging for sand crabs and finding sand dollars and things like that. Things that are a little bit more accessible, right? Just being at the sandy beach. I was a kid who was always walking along and collecting shells and looking at the living things along the beach, like kelp, and like the things that had washed up. So kelp not living anymore. And so I was like always super fascinated by marine invertebrates. I remember actually when I must have been like in third grade or something, like pretty young. We had to do reports on animals, and there was like this list of questions, right? You had to answer about your animal. It was like a standard kind of form list. And these were the days where you would go to the library, right, and ask the librarian to help you find references to help fill in this form. And one of the questions was, what sound does your animal make? Right. This is definitely geared toward people who are interested in mammals. And so was doing my project on sand dollars, and like, which I was amazed to find out were animals when I was, 8 or 9 years old. And so I remember like going to the librarian and asking like, where would I find references to find this? And like, what sound does a sand dollar make? And she was like, oh my gosh, like, I have no idea. Like, I'm not even sure. Like, I can point you to some references. I'm pretty sure they might not make a sound. But that was kind of my first introduction into asking questions about these weird and kind of very poorly understood but magnificent animals. My first place of tide pooling was really at Leo Carrillo. which is a beach in Ventura County for some of you who know it. Um, and that was just like I did it a little bit, but my family, like we weren't my family, my parents were took us outside and tried to get us outside as much as we could be, as much as we spent as much time as we could at the beach. But we were more like go to the beach, put your blanket down, like have your picnic, like swim in the waves, build a sandcastle. Like we weren't let's go tide pooling. So if we happened to tide pool, it's because we happened to be at beaches when the tide was low. My first time, like really purposefully tide pooling at a low tide was in college when I went to UC Berkeley, but we took a field trip to Bodega Marine Lab. And so the first place I ever saw like the Northern California tide pools was at Bodega in the kind of spectacular but narrow, kind of lots of big waves crashing at these beautiful beaches in Bodega. And, I was like super, super fascinated with all of the amazing animals, just into such a tight little space. And I think for me, then when I was in college, it was amazing to see all these animals that a lot of foundational ecology work is based on, like barnacles and snails that I had been reading about. So it was amazing to see those things in real life. But um, for me, the real magic of tide pooling is not only just the diversity of life that you can see in such a small space, right? You can be tide pooling off the Northern California coast here, or Central or Northern California coast, and you can see like every phylum, right? Like it's not just you're seeing a few things, you're really seeing like almost every phylum of living things packed into this really small space. And then it's extra magical because that space is only you can only get there certain times, only when the tide is low. And so it is kind of like this mystery and this magic because it's not the same all the time. You can go to the same beach where you can tide pool, and when the tide is high, it's just water and sand, right? So that's all you can see. So for me, those are the things that make tide pooling super amazing and magical.
That's so cool. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
Yeah, and for those who are listening, please always feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. But I'm wondering for people who are heard of tide pooling but have never actually gone themselves and are interested in witnessing this tide pooling that you describe, what are some of the steps that people can take and yeah, some of the information people should know and how they can prepare for their first outing in tide pooling?
Yeah, the most important thing, right, is to know when the tide is low. So here, I'm guessing that everyone is kind of Bay Area-ish. We, we have two low tides and two high tides every day. And so one of the low tides is lower than the other. And so you always want to make sure it's best to try to get to the lowest low tide of the day. So it kind of goes in 6 hour a 6 hour cycle. So you'll have like the lowest low tide, and then a high tide, and then the next lowest low tide, and then another high tide. And so really getting yourself like figuring out when the low tides are is the most important thing. And so the lowest tides are when we have a new moon or a full moon. So that's one way to know is kind of pay attention to your tide, your lunar cycles. But you can also get a tide book. Like this tide log is the tide log that I love the most. This one is actually printed upside down, so I have to turn it. But it's the most amazing because it has these beautiful visuals of the tides. So not only can you see when the tide is low, it helps you kind of understand how tides work. And I just love it for planning and for looking ahead. But our team, Nat Lowe, who's one of the data scientists who works on my team, oh my gosh, actually, give me just a second, made an amazing tool to find low tides and know when they are and actually add it to your Google Calendar. And it's an incredible tool. So you can use this link, and it's really a tide finder, and you can tell the little app how low you want the tides, and really anything below zero is a good low tide. The lower than -1 is like the best tide pooling, but usually zero tides, you can still get out there. So you can set it like dawn or dusk. Like if you don't really want to go out when it's dark, you can set it, and then um, you can export it to your calendar, and then you can just see when the tides are. If you, I'm going to share another link to our teams, like a bunch of tools that and resources that we've made for tide pooling. One of the things, if you are to download this, to use this app and download, if you use Google Calendars, I recommend making a new calendar and then adding the tides to that calendar. Otherwise, your whole calendar will be filled up with low tides and it will look like you're busy like 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. all summer. You don't really want that. I learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
But I'm like, why is this all in my all over my calendar? But that is to me one of the best ways. So I kind of use a combination of looking in the using this app and then using my little tide log. And I'm going to put the link for the tide log company that makes these tide logs. This is the Northern California link, but you can explore their website and they make a lot these books for lots of different areas. They used to be a local company. They used to be out of West Marin, but they were bought a few years ago. But they've continued making these really spectacular books, and it has corrections for different beaches, right? So the tides that it shows in this book are really for like at the Golden Gate Bridge, and then there's some corrections for the rest of the areas based on the geography. And sometimes like the tides might be a little lower, a little earlier, a little later. Um, so really the number one thing is knowing when the tides are low, and then where to go. I can definitely go into where some of my favorite spots to tide pool are, but really like you want to be prepared. We all are going to beaches that are pretty cold or have the potential to be pretty cold and foggy and wet. So always dressing in layers, and wearing shoes that give you boots or other shoes that give you really good traction, and that you're comfortable getting wet. Some people tide pool in kind of Tiva-ish sandals because they don't care about being cold. But a lot of people wear boots that will protect you from the cold and the water. Um, and you don't really need much more than that. Of course, a camera to take pictures, your cell phone if you want to take pictures. It's good, of course, if anytime you're going to the beach that might be a little treacherous to probably not go by yourself and let other people know where you're going to be, just in case you happen to slip. Most of these beaches don't have any staff or anyone who's around to make sure that you're safe. But one of the things I love about tide pooling is a really low gear activity. I'm not super into tons of gear, and this kind of goes along with that vibe where you don't need a lot of stuff to have a great time and to see lots of different things.
That's so cool. Thank you. And yeah,
Sure.
it sounds like a relatively accessible activity as long as the tide is known and you can kind of just go out there, which is really awesome. And I was wondering for when you plan your trips, when you see when the low tide is, do you aim to get there when it's the lowest, or do you aim to get there like slightly before, or when do you normally plan your time to go?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I usually plan to be there a little bit before, like if it's ideally like an hour before, depending on if that puts you to like 4 in the morning. I don't usually do that, but if it's reasonable, an hour before the low tide is really nice. That gives you a little extra time before the tide is chasing you out. It really depends how low it is. Also, the lower it is, the more time you just have out there. Some I really like being there while the tide is dropping because you have time. But there are a lot of animals, especially nudibranchs, and I can talk more about finding nudibranchs, but sometimes as the tide starts coming in, things that are up along the sides start kind of coming out more as the tide starts coming back in. So definitely bridging that change when the tide is changing is something that I really enjoy, and I feel like you find more things if you're in that kind of transition time.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. And I think earlier you had mentioned that you wouldn't mind going into some of the places around here that you really like tide pooling. Do you mind
Yeah.
sharing some of those places with the group?
Sure. I'm happy to share. I do most of my tide pooling, and my favorite place to tide pool is at Pillar Point, which is near Half Moon Bay. So it's really technically El Granada. It's a little bit north of Half Moon Bay. This is the same place that the Mavericks surf contest happens. Um, it has a parking lot. It's a pretty easy walk out to the reef. I mean, it's kind of far, but it's a pretty easy walk. The reef is the reef, and when I say reef, I mean exposed rocks that are exposed when the tide is low. It's not a coral reef, it's just a shale or rock reef. Um, that reef together with the rocks that extend further north by at the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve and the Montera State Reserve, so all through Moss Beach and El Granada is one of the largest shale reefs in North America, if not the largest. And it's just really spectacular. It can get very crowded. Um, it is a multi-use reef, so fishing is allowed there with a fishing license, of course. So it is used by lots of different people for lots of different things. So it's not a marine protected area. It's adjacent to a marine protected area. But I kind of like it for that, where I like to see a lot of people caring for, even if that caring might be like you care that you can come fish here again into the future. I like seeing, I just love this space. And it's really one of the most diverse places that I can think of. In Marin County, Duxbury Reef or Agate Beach is a nice place to tide pool. You can go north or south from the access there, and it's pretty nice. Steep Ravine, well, Steep Ravine is where the campgrounds are, but Slide Ranch, like a little bit, pretty close to Steep Ravine. Slide Ranch has some accessible tide pools in Marin from folks that are closer to Marin. It's not huge, but it's a pretty interesting area to spend time in for sure. Actually, probably one of the closest places to San Francisco that you can tide pool is at Muir Beach. The little north and south, mostly south of the main beach. There's some little tide pooling spots there that are pretty fun and accessible, and it's a really beautiful beach and pretty easy to get to. And then in San Mateo County, right, you can go further south. Well, the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve, I mentioned it a little bit, but that is a county park, a San Mateo County park, and they have rangers and an amazing crew of dedicated docents that will talk to you about that place. And so it's nice if you want to like have more people to talk to about what you're seeing. And then Pigeon Point is another really nice place in San Mateo County for sure. I mean, I could go on and on, but those are some of the easier places to find. And then for those folks that are up a little further north, along the Sonoma coast, there's the Sonoma Coast state beaches, the coasts and beaches, like that series of beaches. There's lots of great tide pooling there, and some of those places you can be standing on the sand and you can see a lot of things on the rocks. So sometimes that's nice for folks if they don't want to rock on slippery rocks. And then of course Mendocino, there's really really spectacular tide pooling at Van Dam State Park, at Glass Beach, all the really many beaches along the Mendocino coast.
That's terrific. Thank you so much for all the suggestions. I think that's
Sure.
really helpful. And it looks like we have a question from Caitlin. Caitlin, do you want to unmute and ask your question? It's a great question.
Oh, that is a good question.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, do you have
Sure.
any recommendations for field guides for the local tide pool marine life?
Yeah, I should have pulled out. I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. I should have pulled out some guides, some really good guides. I really like. There's one called the Beachcombers Guide that I really like. It's kind of pretty general. I don't see it. Otherwise, I would just grab it to show you the cover. So a couple different Beachcombers Guide. There's an older one that was written by actually one of my professors, by Tom Neeson, who was a professor at San Francisco State. He wrote this amazing guide called the Beachcombers Guide, maybe to the intertidal or something like that. I like that one because it has rocky intertidal, but it also has sandy beaches and mud flats and all these other places where you can see invertebrates. And then someone else made another version that's also called the Beachcombers Guide that is a little newer. And I think the person's last name is like Dwayne Sept, maybe. Dwayne Sept. Yeah, that's one of, so the one that is mentioned lower in the chat. I feel like that one is one of the best that covers kind of like, the basic things that you'll see and has really good information. I didn't know it was updated, so that probably makes it even better.
Mm.
But that Dwayne Sept guide is probably my favorite. There are a couple of books, that are just about seaweeds or just about algae, which is a hard, there's so many different seaweeds off our coast. So there are some really good guides to just the seaweeds that can be helpful if you're really into seaweed, because a lot of those other books they talk more about the animals than the seaweeds for sure.
Awesome. Thank you for those recommendations. And I think I found
Sure.
the Tom Neeson one to drop in the chat, but
Nice. He
um,
also has this older like marine biology coloring book that Tom did that is like really fun if you just want to learn general marine biology. It's like kind of a coloring book for adults before those were popular. I'm not sure if it's in print anymore, but that's a really fun one if you want to learn um, just kind of about marine biology in general with a little bit of a local focus.
that's awesome. Thank you. I'll take a look for that coloring book too. It sounds very fun.
Yeah, it's
Um,
very fun.
I think we have another question from Karen. Karen, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi,
Um,
Karen.
yeah, so I'm an NAI certified interpretive
Oh,
guide
cool.
and a
Good.
naturalist, and I am a docent for state parks along the Sonoma coast,
Yeah.
both for school group tide pool education, and I'm also what we call a roving docent. So
Mhm.
whenever, there's a busy weekend or the tide is low, I go out and I'm interacting and with people. So I'm out there a lot with the public. And the question I have for you, by way of background, is like, what are the most important things that you want visitors to the tide pools to know that we as people who are out interacting with the visitors all the time can try to communicate as part of our interpretive discussion with folks?
That's such a good question. I know, Karen, we've run into each other in the tide pools, so it's nice to
Yeah.
see you in this spot. So I think for me, I mean, I think there are a couple of things, right? I think obviously you do this all the time, right? Is to share your like the awe and wonder and the beauty of these places and how they are really special and pretty unique. Like I think in California, I think there's less than 15 square miles of rocky intertidal, right? So that's not very much. And so these places have all this diversity, and we're so lucky to be able to see it here. So it is this place that you can introduce anyone, kids, families, adults, like everyone, to marine biology, like the diversity of marine organisms in this way that you can't anywhere else. Like not everyone can dive, not everyone can really see these animals in person except in the tide pools, right? Where you can see this just like the amazing diversity. So I think the specialness of it, and it is the animals and the ecosystem is this kind of combination of super hardy and super fragile at the same time, right? They just like deal with this pounding rock, pounding waves, and these changes in temperature and exposure to the air. They have to deal with predators from the water, from the air. They deal with like warm, like air, like they deal with so many different changes. Um, and they've, are doing fine and like surviving and making their livings. But it's pretty easy for us to, do things that aren't great for them, right? Like over harvest, like illegal take, definitely like there's a place for fishing and with a fishing license in the right places. But I think like over harvest and poaching of things is obviously super harmful. Um, there are some other things that, and when we're out there and tide pooling, right, we are in many cases walking like on these animals. And so when you are out there, it's just being like as careful as you can and being responsible. Um, to not, I mean, the main thing I say is like to not scuff your feet all around because that's actually the worst thing. Like taking up and down steps is fine. One of the things that I think about a lot is that, by being out there, we're probably doing some damage, right? Like you're stepping on some things, like you might accidentally step on a snail or a hermit crab. But I don't want people to be like, I shouldn't be out there because there might be this like incidental harm. Because if nobody's out there, like we're not experiencing this joy and we're not forming these connections and the love of this place. And it's really, really important, especially in times like now where, we're in the midst, like the climate is changing, like these animals and these ecosystems are under threat from forces that are not like us walking along the beach, right? Like rising sea levels and warming oceans are more harmful to these things than us being there. And if we're going to really mobilize to make the big differences and to fight for the big differences, in policy and like all of the things that need to happen, then we need to have connections to these places, and more people need to have a connection and a love for this place, whether it's just to go see a starfish for the first time or it's like to harvest mussels to make cioppino. Like we all have to have connections in order to make a difference. And so I think just helping people form those connections is and like I know you know this from your training, but like finding the thing that connects people to the place, like from their regular life, like what do you love and what does this place have that you might love? As far as things to do, one of the things that, through our work is we encourage people to make iNaturalist observations while they're in the tide pools, so they can learn about what they're seeing. And also because when they share observations, they're gathering data about the species that are in these different places. And then my team works together with the California Ocean Protection Council and California Department of Fish and Wildlife to use those data to help understand our changing coast and to help inform policy. And so by making observations, you're actually contributing to our understanding of these places and the policies and the decisions that the state are making. And like right now, we're working together with CDFW to share all of the iNaturalist data with the state, like en masse, which has never happened before in any state in California, in the country, actually. So iNaturalist data is currently not used en masse by state decision to help make state decisions. And so we're working on building these pipelines. So as the state is making decisions about like what places to protect, what species are where, this is for the land and the sea, but those data that we're sharing are collected by people like all of us, like making and sharing observations when they're out on the coast. So I think that is probably one of the most important things to do.
So could I ask a follow-up question on that then? How important is it for those of us who are out there all the time to be uploading to iNaturalist sort of the routine things, as opposed to, oh, we found a sick or injured mammal, we found sea star wasting disease, we saw a nudibranch that we don't usually see here. The tide
Yeah.
was super low, so we were able to get out and see lots of sponges and tunicates. Like, how important is it for us to be constantly going, and here's 27,000 more ochre sea stars, and here's 157 billion barnacles? And
yeah, it's a really, really good question. I mean, I think one thing about iNaturalist is it's not really about abundance. So like, don't worry about taking pictures of like everything you see, but like this species was here now is really what those data are better, like that's what they show more easily. I also don't think like when most people are out there doing docenting, they have other things to do, right? Than take pictures of everything. I do think there's like a core, like, yeah, sure, like the rare, this thing I've never seen is super, super important. But yeah, take pictures of some of the standard things. Like, okay, here's an anemone, here's an urchin, here's we have, I don't know if you've ever seen for Snapshot Cal Coast, which is one of the campaigns we run, we have a most wanted species guide. And on the inside, there's like a checklist page that's just like, hey, make sure you take pictures of these things. And so, when I'm out, I don't take pictures, especially when I'm leading groups. I don't take pictures of every single thing because I can't. But I try, like, as I'm walking by, I'm like, oh, have I taken a picture of that species? So yet, and I just try to do like a kind of the things I always look for. And it might not be more than like 25 things, right? But I just try to kind of, because I know a little bit more about how those data are being used, right? And so just to have like a little bit of a, I don't know, just like a little bit of a tally of like how things are looking and what's regular and what's new. Kind of what I try to do.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
We have several questions about nudibranchs too, so I'm wondering if we can shift to talking about nudibranchs a little more specifically.
Sure.
Like, for those who don't know, could you give a quick overview of what a nudibranch is? And then we have a question from Tina about what are some great places to see nudibranchs. It sounds like Tina lives in Petaluma and mostly goes to
Cool.
Agate Beach. And then Julie also asked what time is a good time to see nudibranchs. And then like where are good places and how do you even see them? They can be really tiny. Yeah, so just nudibranchs.
Yeah, nudibranchs. Okay, so for those folks that don't know, nudibranchs are sea slugs or a type of sea slug. There are sea slugs. So nudibranchs don't have any shell. So they're true slug. They have, but when they're a larva, in their larval form, they do have a shell, like their snail relatives. So they're gastropods, just like other snails. They, along our coast, they can range from like very, very, very tiny, like smaller than a grain of rice, to maybe like the biggest that we have, or maybe like, 5 inches at the very, very biggest. They mostly eat encrusting animals, so sponges, some things that maybe some folks haven't heard of. They're a little bit obscure. Sponges, bryozoans, which are moss animals, like a colonial animal. Sea anemones and sea anemone relatives. So they're this really interesting thing in that they're grazers, almost all of them, but they graze on other animals, not on grass or algae. There are some slugs that eat algae, but by and large, most nudibranchs, like true nudibranchs or sea slugs, are carnivorous and they eat other animals. So one way to find them is to think about where their food might live. And that's usually along the edges of tide pools, like under ledges, places that are, so the biggest key is actually places that are pretty far out toward the ocean, so very low intertidal, but not where the waves are directly crashing. So if you imagine like there's a tide pool pretty far out, but it's protected from direct wave action, or like a big surge. So big surges, like imagine you're like a little slug, like you don't really want to be in a place with like a huge surge that's going to take you way out back to the ocean. If the surge is kind of parallel to the shore, sometimes they're in those places. But generally, like the bigger the tide pool, lower the intertidal, but not with a lot of wave action, those are the best places. And really like around the edges, a lot of times when the tide has like just shifted and the tide is starting to rise, you'll see the slugs that were around the edges starting to crawl on surf grass or on other seaweeds, and so you'll just see them out and about. But it really helps to have seen one time, either have someone show you. Like once you see one, then you're like, oh, now I get how small it is. Now I get how you really can find them. But really once you kind of get an eye for them, it's easier to find them for sure. I'm trying to think what else I could say about nudibranchs. They're just spectacular. They're all these different colors, right? They're like yellow, orange, pink, like things that you can even imagine. We have two, there are a few main groups of nudibranchs, but the two that are easiest to really understand and to tell apart are the dorids, which are nudibranchs that have kind of two little, well, all nudibranchs have these. They have two little rhinophores or sensory organs. They look like antenna. Like if you had to choose a word, if you didn't know what they're called, you would say antenna. But rhinophore just kind of means like nose smellers. So that's kind of what they are, like sensory organs. And then the dorids have a little circle of gills on the back. It looks like a little flower, and those are their gills. They breathe through those gills. Those mostly eat sponges and bryozoans, or those moss animals. The ones people might know, like the most common ones here, are a group that are sometimes colloquially called sea lemons, which is a few different species that are yellow and they look like little lemons, or someone thought they looked like lemons. And then there's a beautiful pink nudibranch that's called Hopkins Rose, that's named after the Hopkins Marine Station. Timothy Hopkins, actually, the adopted son of, well, it's a pretty long story, but Hopkins is named after the Hopkins Marine Lab. So the apostrophe goes after the S, not before it. And this is actually a Dora nudibranch. It has gills and it has rhinophores, but it has all these projections off its back that make it kind of confusing, because it looks like the other group of nudibranchs, which are called aelids. And these are nudibranchs that just have these projections, or serrata, coming off their back or their mantle. They don't have separate gills. They just actually have extensions of their gut that come into those projections, and they just diffuse oxygen across that surface. The aelids primarily eat the relatives of sea anemones, like sea anemones and their relatives. And they do something simply amazing, is that they take the stinging cells of sea anemones and hydroids, and they take those stinging cells and they put them into their own serrata for their own defense. So you can actually get stung by a nudibranch with the same stinging cells that it came from its prey. Those Dora nudibranchs, they don't get to have that, like nobody celebrates them in that same way, but they actually take compounds or chemical compounds from their sponge prey, and they do the same thing. So they can take those chemical compounds and they can put them into their own tissues, and it makes them unpalatable to predators. So they do something similar, but it's not taking like a cell, it's just taking a compound. So those are the two kind of main groups. There are some others that fall out of that group, but you know, there's a huge group of folks that are very, very interested in nudibranchs, like amateur folks who get out there and take tons of pictures. And I'll give you like a little like, I don't know, hot off the presses, maybe. We're considering like having kind of a campaign that's around just sea slugs, the way we have Snapshot Cal Coast. We do something called the Solstice Sea Star Search that's all for sea stars. And we're working with some colleagues about thinking about having like an annual kind of nudibranch day, couple days, to have people just look for nudibranchs, because we want those data, and also people are so into them that it seems like something really fun to capitalize on.
That's so cool. Oh my goodness, that's so cool. And I was wondering, of the places that you mentioned earlier, the tide pooling locations, are those all
Yeah.
about like places you could see a nudibranch?
Yeah, for sure.
That's so
Definitely. I mean, you can see nudibranchs. Like, one easy place to see nudibranchs that is not tide pools and it is not tide dependent is if you can get access to a dock. Like if you live near a harbor or a dock and the folks would let you go out onto the dock, and you lean over the side and you can look and see all the encrusting invertebrates that have made their lives there. If you're patient and are willing to like lie down, get up, and like lie down and like go back all up and down the dock, you often can see nudibranchs who eat those encrusting invertebrates. Things that are a little bit more marine will sometimes even make it into, you know, the harbor, like in San Francisco Bay. You'll see them at Treasure Island or in the marina, but lots of marinas around the bay. You can see a bunch of nudibranchs there.
so cool.
But yeah, all the places that I mentioned, you should be able to see slugs.
That's awesome. Thank you. See, Julie and Tina, were there any other questions about nudibranchs? If so, let me know. But if not, I think we can move to Richard's question. Richard, do you mind unmuting and asking your question? It's another great question.
So sometimes I probably when I was younger I did this more. Today I travel more with a camera than a fishnet.
Yes.
But sometimes it's nice to be able to collect something and put it in a small aquarium to get better pictures of it and watch it for a while. Now, my understanding is that in practically all regional, state, and federal parks. That's illegal. And then even outside of those parks, there's a restriction on what you can collect and what you can't. So it's very complicated. Are there any guides online that you can go to that give you some guidance?
Yes. Okay. So I have this saved in the chat. So first I'm going to chat. I want to answer your question, Richard. I'm going to chat you like this suite of tools about tide pooling my team has made, including that tide chart, like that tide finder. But this is the sport fishing, like ocean sport fishing regulations. It's like incredibly detailed. It's mostly about fishing for fish, but there are parts about invertebrates, and that's about what you can take. That's like taking home, right, with a fishing license. So this isn't quite your question, Richard, but I just want to make sure people know that this is where you find like the actual regulations. So what you're talking about is like, let's say you find a nudibranch and you want to take a picture of it, and it would be easier to do that if it was in like a little plastic container to take a picture. So at beaches that are not part of marine protected areas, so like Pillar Point, for example, like you can do that. It's not a state park. It's actually the jurisdiction is a little complicated. So you're allowed to do that in those kinds of places. You can't collect these things, like really collect them and like take them home. I tell people if they want to take pictures in that way, to just not go very far from where you found that thing and try to put it back right where you found it. Personally, I take pictures of the slugs that I find like where I found them, or like in the tide pools, I like push them down a little further. Like I have a little method for taking pictures that is not in a container. But everybody does it kind of differently. In marine protected areas, which some of the places that I've mentioned are marine protected areas, like Duxbury Reef is a marine protected area. The Fitzgerald Marine Reserve is part of a marine protected area. I want to say this like just right. Like there are some interpretations of the Fish and Wildlife Code that says putting things in, touching them at all, or putting them in a container is take. And take is what Fish and Wildlife calls, like if you take something, like you take a fish home, you're taking it. If you scare marine mammals, that's also a kind of take, right? So take is used in this way that's like harassment, kind of. So some folks have interpreted the no take as you can't touch things and you shouldn't put them in containers at all. But it's kind of an interpretation. But it's up to them to make that judgment. Many of these folks that have made that assessment have to deal with people who are actually poaching, and it's really, really hard to tell the difference between someone that has a bucket and is taking things and someone is taking a bucket and is taking pictures. And so it makes it hard for them to like manage their visitors, and so they make rules about not putting anything in the containers. But really and truly, Fish and Wildlife has never said like this, you cannot do this at all. But at least and I haven't been following this super closely, but what they have said is like, please don't ask us to make a judgment about what is take and what is not take, because nobody would like the answer, because it would be like very, very strictly interpreted. It would be like, don't walk here, don't touch this, don't touch that. So they've kind of don't want to have to make that assessment, which I understand, but it's made this kind of gray area that's kind of like, in some cases, pitted like environmental educators against each other who have different philosophies about how to be in the tide pools. So this is a really long answer because this is something that comes up all the time. So I think there are some places that are marine protected areas that have extra protection, especially the no-take reserves, that I think it's best to be really, really cautious there, and do your best to follow the guidelines of the folks that are managing those places. And like you can hold, I have like two thoughts at the same time. And I also think that it's important as people are learning to be able to touch things and to be able to be like, oh, this is how you tell this is a sponge versus a tunicate versus this, because they feel different. And like, that's how you tell them apart. So it's a tricky area. hope my rambling answer didn't really answer exactly what you said, but just so you know some of the subtleties, like that's kind of where it comes from. You can, as educators, if people are educators, you can apply for a scientific collecting permit that allows you to touch things or move things around inside or outside MPAs, and a lot of organizations do apply for those kinds of permits that give them permission. So then if they are doing something that they don't want the general public to do, they can talk about how they have a permit that allows them to do that. And that it's a little bit tricky for individuals to get those kind of permits, but a lot of entities or organizations get those kind of permits.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a great question, Richard, and a really helpful response, Rebecca. I think it sounds very complicated, but yeah, it's great to be careful but also, experience the places we get to visit. So thank you. And I think we had another question from Robert. Robert, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I think it's a good question as well. Robert, do you want to unmute? Otherwise, I can also ask, I think. Let's see. Robert's question was, what are some things we shouldn't do in terms of protecting sea life and their environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think locally, like if you're visiting places, I think, just be careful when you're visiting, pack in your trash, pack it out, like just don't, try to be the best kind of steward of those places while you're there. I think as far as protecting, like doing like overall things that people can do to protect these places, I think to get involved in your local, there are these marine protected area collaboratives in every coastal county. You can look on the MPA Collaborative Network website and find out the collaborative near you and go to their meetings and learn about what's going on. If you have time to volunteer in these places and talk to people about the things that you love, that's a great way to help out. You can work to advocate for legislation that you care about to keep these places safe. There's a climate bond on the ballot this fall that has a lot of money for restoration along the coast and for planning for sea level rise and other like things that we really need to plan for. There's a lot of money for coastal research and restoration in that legislation. So you can learn more about legislation that can help these places. I mean, you can try to drive all these like driving less and like, try to use less fossil fuels and advocate for the reduction in fossil fuels. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, we still would see lots of negative implications from what we've already done. So think about, I sometimes find it not very satisfying, like the personal actions, but they are meaningful, but really advocating for the changes that you want to see in policy and legislation that do directly impact these places is another thing that you can do.
Totally. Thank you for those suggestions. And let's see, Julie just asked a question. Julie, do you want to unmute and ask?
Hi there. I just
Hi,
want to
Julie.
know if the sea stars are recovering from their recent population decline, especially in our, well, anywhere, but especially in our area. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So, as many of you know, in like about 10 years ago, there was this sea star wasting disease that hit the west coast of North America. It was one of the largest die-offs or like examples of a marine disease to hit many species of sea stars or starfish along the whole coast from kind of Alaska all the way into Baja. And so we lost a lot of stars. So many species were affected. Some of the most common starfish, like the ochre star at Pillar Point, for example, we saw like a 90% decline in those in seeing Pisaster at all. And so most of the species that were really hard hit by the sea star wasting have recovered and are doing seemingly fine. So Pisaster ocracius, the leather star, the bat star, six-rayed, the little six-rayed star, Henricia. So almost all the species have really made what looks like a pretty full recovery. There are two species in California, especially, that we haven't seen recover. One that we hear a lot about is the sunflower star. So this is Pycnopodia helianthoides. It's a really large star, like 20 plus arms, super voracious predator. We used to see them pretty commonly in the tide pools, like one, you know, we won't see a lot of them. You see like one. I have not seen one seen one in the San Mateo coast since 2014. And so this species was really, really hard hit by the wasting, and the impact of the loss of this species in California is most evident in the Northern California tide pools, because this animal is a voracious predator, like I said, and it used to eat tons and tons of urchins, and it kept the urchin population in check. And urchins love to eat kelp, and so without their predator, urchins have eaten, you know, all these kelp forests off the Northern California coast. The loss of the kelp up there has caused lots of changes, of course, to the fishing industry, to the protection that kelp forests give to the shore. A lot of the animals all the other animals that eat kelp besides urchins, like abalone and the big chitons, have moved into the intertidal because there's no more kelp to eat. And so it's actually kind of amazing. You can go tide pooling in Mendocino and it's all full of abalone. Like, it's something you can't even count the abalone that you're seeing, but they're not doing great. They're just in the tide pools. And so they've eaten all the tide pool kelps. So they've really changed. It's really changed what it looks like there. This is one of the things that I always say after the wasting, where there was a big warm water blob that contributed to the sea star wasting disease, but also caused a shift in where we saw a lot of different species. And you still go tide pooling and it'd be spectacular, right? You'd see amazing things. You'd see nudibranchs, you'd see algae, you'd see anemones, you'd see most of the things, maybe not starfish, during the wasting. And that was the first time, this is about 10 years ago, that I realized, like, this is what climate change looks like. It doesn't look like a wasteland. It looks like things shifting and things that are just a little different. And so that's kind of what it feels like in Mendocino right now, where it's still, places are spectacular and you can see amazing things, but you're like, oh wait, there's no intertidal kelp because there's all these abalones that are eating it. And so Pycnopodia, the sunflower star, has not returned. It's actually returned in most of its range. It's recovered a bit, not completely, but a bit. But in California, it's been a lot slower to recover. And I think, yeah, so there have been very few sightings of Pycnopodia in California. There's one I saw this summer in Mendocino, one little very famous baby, most photographed little sunflower star you'll ever see. And there are a lot of people who are doing work to figure out where they are. And then we are doing work here, like my colleagues here are raising Pycnopodia from animals that have been in human care from before the wasting disease. So they have adults at the aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach and a couple other places, and they've had some spawns. And we are raising these tiny, tiny baby Pycnopodia. They're like very, very small and very amazing. And so there are a lot of people working to make sure that this animal, especially animals from California, are to keep them alive, to ensure there's genetic diversity in that population, to keep them healthy. So people are doing that, thinking about how potentially in the future, there might be a path to reintroduction here in California. The other star that we haven't seen really recover is another species of Pisaster called Pisaster brevis finus. It's a pink sea star. If you've ever seen this, you see it in touch. We used to see it have it in our touch tide pool. It lives more on sandy beaches, but we used to see it in the tide pools too. And I have also not seen that one since 2014, but it doesn't get a lot of it doesn't get as much press because it hasn't led to like a huge ecosystem change. It mostly ate sand dollars and it lives in sandy beaches. But yeah, so this is why we have the solstice sea star search twice a year, to have people get out there and look for starfish so we can, know that many eyes, and it's really fun to look for like one group of things. And we can learn more about the stars that we still see now, and just kind of mobilize people to get out there. And so that will be this year in December. The good tides are about a little bit before the solstice this year, so like the 13th and 14th. So yeah, you can look on our page and learn more about all of that work.
That is so cool. And let's see, I think it is 1 p.m. We have one last quick question from Julie. Where can you find bryozoans?
Oh my gosh, bryozoans are very hard to see, but you can find them in the tide pools, kind of in the same place that I was talking about finding nudibranchs. The one that's easiest to see is pink, and it has like a hard structure. It almost, I'm trying to think how to describe it. It almost is like a hard film. It's not very thick, and it's almost like if you've had a really, really, really flat shell and it was like encrusting on the rocks. It's pink, and then it has these little tiny circles, and if you could look closely with a magnifying glass or a camera, it has these little tiny individuals that come out of these little circles. You can Google bryozoan and see some pictures. There are some that live on kelp. There's one especially that lives on kelp. So actually one of the easiest ways to see a bryozoan, it probably won't be alive, but if you're walking along the beach and you see kelp that's washed up and you look at the fronds, sometimes you can see like there's a crunchy part. Oh, can everyone hear me, or just
I can hear
only
you.
Pam? Okay, only Pam. Sorry, Pam. So if there's like a little crunchy part, so if you've seen the front and then you see something on it that looks like you move it and it goes, that is a bryozoan colony that's on the kelp frond. They're very cool. So if you do see them, like, you're very lucky.
It's so cool. And yeah, I think that with that we can wrap it up. But yeah, I think that this has been so cool. And what struck me is just like tide pools seem like right at the interface of a very changing ocean and then land. And it's like it's a very interesting place to see, and it's changing very quickly. But thank you so much for sharing your hour with us, sharing your expertise with us, and suggestions for
Sure.
tide pooling. This has been really fun. And thank you all for joining today in the audience, sharing your questions, and for being here for the hour. And I will send an email to you all with some of the links that we mentioned in chat today. And maybe we could all like unmute and say thank you to Rebecca all together. If anyone's interested. Okay, let's try this. Okay. Maybe 3, 2, 1.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Rebecca. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. I put a link to our community science email in the chat. If you if you would like to be on our tide pool list to hear about when we're going to Pillar Point, or just learn more about Snapshot, you can send an email to that address and just say, please put me on your tide pool list. And then we'll add you, and then you'll get emails from us about when we're going out.
Happy tide pooling.
Happy tide pooling. And it's a little break right now. You can't really tide pool until November. So you can dream of tide pooling until November.
Awesome.
Thank you all so much. And thanks, Leah, and thanks, Bay Nature, for hosting this. It's really great. Thanks to all of you for your support of Bay Nature. Put my board chair hat on. Thanks so much for your support of Bay Nature.
Awesome.
And have a good day.
Thanks, Leah.
Take care.